Hi, everyone. It's very loud. I'm very excited. It really doesn't matter who I am because I'm here to introduce the next speaker. But since I'm up here, my name is Tara, and I run a Twitter account called Goat User Stories, and I have stickers if anybody wants one later. But the most important thing is that I'm here to introduce Sean Griffin, who's going to tell you all kinds of awesome things about him. But just so you know, he is a Ruby on Rails committer. He works in open source full-time. He is an employee of Shopify up in Canada, America's hat. Woohoo! And he's going to talk to you today about anatomy of a good pull request. Woohoo! Welcome, Sean.
Thank you very much. So yes, my name is Sean Griffin. I'm a 10x Hacker Ninja guru at Shopify. If you're wondering what that means, it means I was curious what would happen if I put that on some government paperwork, and then they gave me a work permit for 10x Hacker Ninja guru, and I cannot legally work in Canada with any other job title, so. I'm also no longer allowed to fill out paperwork unsupervised. But yeah, so Shopify pays me to work on open source full time. I mainly focus on Ruby on Rails. And if we've interacted at all in the past outside of at a conference, there's a good chance it looked something like this. I close a lot of pull requests, and sorry. I originally wanted to call this talk Why I Closed Your Pull Request, but that sort of gave the wrong tone. Because it's not really meant to be a negative thing, and it's definitely not about me. It's about how you can have a bigger impact when you contribute to open source. So I want to show you some techniques that you can use to submit higher quality pull requests when you're submitting to Rails or any other open source project. Some of the techniques I'm going to talk about are subjective and will vary from project to project. I'm definitely coming at this from the focus of what I look for when I'm accepting pull requests into Rails. But I think the majority of projects are looking for something at least somewhat similar to what I'm presenting here. I'm going to be showing some real-world examples in this talk, both of things that were done well and things that were done less than well. I've done my best to remove any identifying information of any people involved that aren't members of the Rails team. If you really wanted to, you could probably go track this down, but I'd like to ask that people please don't do that and be respectful of people's privacy. I don't want anybody getting shamed because I included their pull request in this talk. So let's start with the absolute bare minimum that you should be doing before you open a pull request. I'm not going to say too much on these just because there's not as much to say on them, but these are the absolute basics. First, you need to read the contributing file, contributing.md, contributing with no extension, whatever format it might be in. And I should also point out that it's not just about reading it, it's also about doing what it says inside of it. Some people have had issues with that. The code should be quality code. Remember that when you're submitting a pull request to open source, you're not writing code for you. You're writing code that somebody else is going to have to maintain. So make sure that's code that you're proud of, code that you think is acceptable for somebody else to maintain for you. If you don't have tests, add some tests. If your change doesn't require tests, more often than not, it might not be a change worth submitting. Don't get me wrong, you can have a solid refactoring that legitimately improves the quality of the code base but doesn't have any visible change in behavior. That's great, and do submit those. But in my experience, we don't get very many pull requests like that from people outside of the core committer team. Usually when an outside person is submitting a pull request that doesn't require tests, it's something like renaming a variable or something else that in Rails we call a cosmetic patch. And they're valuable to have, but in open source, we tend to value Git churn much more highly than you might in app code because we have to rely on Git history a lot more. So at least in Rails, we flat out have a policy against rejecting cosmetic patches. So I think that if your code doesn't require tests, you should consider whether it's worth submitting in the first place. And if it doesn't have tests, make sure it has tests. And finally, if there's a style guide, follow the style guide. So here it is on one slide, so you can take pictures and tweet them and make me sound smart like I know how to submit pull requests. These things are the bare minimum. If you haven't done these things before submitting, do them. End of story. So now let's talk about the things that are a little bit more subtle. I think a common misconception people have about pull requests and open source in general is that they're about code. But they're really not. People think that the code should speak for itself, that the code should stand on its own, that it should present itself based on its own merits. But that's just not true, and it's not what a pull request is about. A pull request is a sales pitch. Your job is to convince the project maintainers why your patch should be merged. And there's a few aspects to that. The first thing that you want to do is to make it easy to review. First and foremost, this means keeping the size reasonable. Nobody wants to review a pull request that looks like this. This amount of code is going to take days to review. It's more likely to just end up sitting at the back of the backlog and only get looked at when there's nothing else to review. And trust me, there's always something else to review. Actually, my first pull request, major pull request to Rails that I'm most well known for, originally had over 1,000 lines of code changed. I made this mistake. But if your pull request is too large, you can do what I did in that circumstance. Consider breaking it apart. Find little bits and pieces that you can break off from the main pull request and submit them independently. If you've given the maintainers some context about the larger change that you're trying to make, submitting a pull request that might not necessarily make sense in a vacuum, but saying this is a refactoring in service of this X thing that you know that I'm trying to do, is often enough. And if your change is large enough that this is even remotely a consideration, please, please, please talk to the maintainers of the project before starting. Make sure it's a change that they want to have made. I hate seeing somebody who's put a ton of work into a huge pull request for a feature that never was going to get accepted in the first place, and I could have told them that before they started working on it. And keep them in the loop about the context of what you're trying to accomplish. Another way that you can make your pull request easier to review is to make sure that all of the context required to understand the problem is right there. Include links to any relevant sources that you have. If it's a bug fix, link to the original issue. If you're adding support for some Postgres feature to an ORM, link to the section in the Postgres docs that describe the feature. If you're making sure a web framework conforms to some RFC, link to the relevant section in the RFC. It's also worth linking to any prior commits in the related code that are relevant to what you're doing. If you're writing a bug fix, including a link to the commit that originally introduced the bug is almost always worth having. Don't assume that the maintainer already knows about the feature that you're trying to add or the problem that you're trying to fix. This takes 5 extra minutes, but it makes a world of difference to the reviewer. And just like the code you shouldn't assume that code speaks for itself. You also shouldn't assume that the problem speaks for itself. And when I say problem, it's sort of a vague, hand-wavy term. I'm using this as the umbrella to refer to both bug fixes and new features. The lack of a feature is a problem. Now, sometimes problems are very clear-cut. For example, if I had a library for adding padding to the beginning of strings, because that's a thing that should totally get packaged as a library, and that library seg-faulted when the string isn't Unicode or something, then yeah, that's a pretty clear-cut bug. My topical jokes are not topical anymore. But oftentimes, the line between bug and de facto feature can get really, really blurry. Or sometimes the change just introduces too much complexity to justify the cost. There's a lot of things that we have to consider when we're making a change or when we're accepting a change. How many of our users are affected? We're, of course, going to be more likely to accept a fix to a bug that affects 95% of our user base, as opposed to one that affects 5%. How complex is the fix? A lot of people think that open source maintainers are somehow magic, and that we have like infinite time or energy, or that our code base doesn't follow the same laws as application code, but it does. Adding complexity means that it's more likely that additional bugs will be introduced in the future. Adding complexity makes the code base harder to understand. Adding complexity makes it harder to onboard new contributors. All of the same considerations that you would have to adding complexity to your own code bases still apply in open source. Is the fix a change in behavior in the public API? Stability is a big deal to open source maintainers. Just because a bug exists doesn't always mean it should be fixed. In many cases, bugs end up over time just turning into de facto features. Here's an example. Now, I know not everybody here uses Rails, so let me walk you through this as best I can. Active Record is our library for database persistence. And when you want to have a class that maps one-to-one with a database table, you inherit from the class Active Record base. That's what the less than sign means in Ruby, if you don't do Ruby. We have some class macros that are describing the relationships between tables. So on the second line, we're saying that a user has many posts. So posts will have a foreign key that points to the users table. And then the second argument is a lambda saying that we want to order the results there by the title of the post. Down below, we see that post has many comments. It's the same thing, and we're ordering that by the text of the comments. And then that line in the second line in the user class, has many comments through posts, is saying that we want to be able to, from a user, get all of the comments left on all of the posts written by that user. And what's important here is that both of these other associations have orders on them. Now, what you would expect to have happen here is that you order by the post, and then after you've done that, you order by the comment. So they'll be grouped by the post, and then they'll be grouped by the comment. What we end up doing is the opposite. And from looking at the commits, it just appears to be a historical accident. We apply the comments ordering first, and then the posts ordering. So the post's title will end up overriding the comment body in the final order. It gets higher precedence, which is just, it's really weird and it's confusing and I can't change it. Like, I hate having this interaction with people where, like, this person was right. Their change was fine. And the resulting behavior would be better, but that's not the only consideration that we have to make. I'm not going to make a breaking change to behavior that's been that way for almost a decade at this point, especially when I know a lot of code is relying on it, including code bases that I have to work on. So if the fix is a change in behavior, because we will sometimes accept breaking changes. It's always a trade-off. It's a consideration. If the change does constitute a change in behavior to public API, though, what happens when somebody's relying on the old code? Is their code going to blow up? Or is it going to just start silently doing the wrong thing and introducing subtle bugs into everybody's code bases? We're always more likely to accept something that is the former. Are we able to detect whether they were relying on the old behavior? And if so, can we introduce a deprecation warning? If that's the case, then it's always more likely that that change will be accepted. Is there a workaround? How easy is it to work around the problem if we don't introduce the fix? Because at the end of the day, if a bug only impacts a handful of people, and there's a workaround, and the workaround is easy, and the change introduces a massive amount of complexity to the code base, it might just be better not to merge it. Now, with every bug fix, every feature, there's always a million different ways that you can go about approaching the problem. And when you submit a pull request, you've chosen this one, which presumably you think is the best. Tell us why. Tell us what the alternatives were. Give us the context that you've considered. Help us to understand why the code is written the way that it is. Help us make sure that we know that we're not cutting off our ability to go down another path later, and that this is the one that we want to go down to solve this problem. Now, this has actually been coming up a lot more in Twitter and conversations recently, this idea of open source entitlement. So I'd like to just make sure that this is clear. Nobody is entitled to having their pull request merged. A lot of people hate this because they're like, well, I just did all this work and I gave you this free code and you should take it because I did this work for you. And in open source, we sometimes talk about whether something is free as in beer or free as in speech. A pull request is kind of neither. Pull request is free as in puppy. Right, so ultimately, your change is something that the project is going to have to maintain for the foreseeable future. So here's an interaction that happened a couple months ago. A person submits a change to Rails, and it has no tests. So a member of our issues team is the first to respond, and he's asking, hey, should we add a regression test? Because we just have a straight-up policy. We don't accept changes to behavior without tests. Apparently, this was some code that didn't already have tests around it, so this person said that they didn't feel motivated to add it. And then Eileen, who I think might be here, who is the person who is assigned to it, comes back with, again, our straight-up policy. Regardless of whether or not there were tests there before, we need a test in order to accept this. And then we get, sorry, I'm just not interested in catching up with your test debt. Okay, well, sorry, maybe I'm just not interested in accepting your patch. In this case, they did end up adding a test, and they ended up editing that comment to be less nasty, and everything was fine, and the change was eventually merged. But it's important to keep in mind, when you submit a pull request to a project, here's what you're actually saying. Hello, here's some code I wrote. Would you like to maintain it until the end of time for me? Because the thing is, most patch authors aren't going to stick around. We've had more than 2,400 people contribute to Ruby on Rails. More than half of those have had 3 or fewer commits. And I'm sure that percentage is even larger if I exclude documentation changes, but that's not a number that we track. At the end of the day, the person who will maintain the code that you submit isn't going to be you. It's the project owners. And even if you fully intend to help maintain the code that you wrote, that's just not something that we're going to assume based on our own past experiences. And that means that it's very important for us to be picky about what patches are or are not accepted. That's why we have to have very strict policies around no changes without adding tests. And most importantly, we have to be very picky when somebody is adding a new feature. Because in open source, features are really easy to add, but they're almost impossible to change or to remove later. And since most often we'll only see 1 or 2 pull requests from a person, I usually prefer to see a really good commit message that contains a lot of context. Now, the commit message is the most convenient place to brief someone on your change, including the reviewer. I recently had a pull request where this was the entire commit message. Merges parent association joins for through associations into a scope. Previously, joins in association scope were taken into account only for root associations with that scope. Now, this commit mostly touched code that I wrote or was familiar with, and I still was not entirely sure what that meant. And the code didn't really help me understand it either. Tests would have helped too, but with the commit message, what I really want to see here, how was the user seeing this bug? Why did the bug occur? What are they seeing now? Why does this fix the bug? Now, you may be wondering why I care so much about commit messages. Well, for me, it's the main way I communicate with most people. Whenever I'm looking at some code and don't quite get why something is that way, or if I need a question answered, the first thing I'll do is I'm going to git blame, and I'm going to read the commit message. Also, I'd like to nominate git blame for the worst named tool commonly used in development. Like, this is an alias that I have in my terminal, and I highly recommend everybody else do the same. But the important thing to know is that you should document all the context you can in your commit message. After all, this isn't for you. It's for other people. Although other people does include you next week. I swear, if I had a nickel for every time I'm going through some code, I'm like, oh my God, this is terrible. Why would anybody ever write it this way? Git blame. Oh my God, what were they thinking? And it's me. It's always me. But at least sometimes I apologize to my future self in the commit message. Now, in the commit message, I'm going to drink some water. In the commit message, I don't really care much about the what or the how, because the code's right there. I can see what you changed. I can see how you changed it from the code. What I want to know is why. Why did this change get made? Why did you do it this way? Why didn't you do it another way? Literally anything else that went through your head that might be even remotely useful, please. That's where I want to see it. Now, a lot of the why, some people will tend to put this in code comments. I usually prefer to avoid those and keep them in the commit message instead, because code comments end up getting out of sync with code over time. People make changes to the code, they don't update the comments. A commit message has this beautiful property of being a comment on a line of code at a very specific point in time. And assuming your commit message wasn't just lying to begin with, assuming it was ever correct, your commit message will never become incorrect over time. And as those changes get made to a code base, the kind that would lead to a comment getting out of date, if all of those commit messages contain the why, by going back 2 or 3 commits on a line of code, I can construct a very vibrant story about how we got into the situation that code is now in for whatever problem I'm trying to solve. Now, I don't have a hard rule for how long a commit message should be, but generally speaking, if you're ever asking yourself, this is a pretty long commit message, I'm not sure if it's too long or not, the answer is no. It's never too long. Here's an example of one of my commits from a little over a year ago. I doubt anybody can read this, and you don't need to. What's important is that this is 9 paragraphs. It has code examples. So you'd expect this is probably a huge change, right? If by huge you mean 1 line, then yes. This is my record for lines of commit message to lines of code change ratio. But this change had a huge impact. And it turns out that the amount of context available isn't necessarily related to the number of lines of code changed. And while we're on the subject of committing habits, here's a couple of more tips. Keep your commits separate during code review. Now, we usually, at least in Rails, we'll eventually want the commits squashed down to a single commit before we merge. But during code review, it's best to keep them separate. That way, reviewers can easily see what's changed. And GitHub nowadays also will, when you push a new commit, will inform the reviewers that you've pushed a new commit. Whereas if you force push, we don't get that notification. Now, some projects will be fine with you keeping your commits separate forever, and they'll end up just pushing the big green button. Rails will usually ask you to squash and rebase them before we merge it. That'll differ from project to project, but pretty universally, everybody's going to want you to keep them separate during code review. It makes reviewing much easier. And if you are squashing your commits, amend your commit message when you're squashing it. If you have multiple commits that are being squashed, this probably means there's new context that came up during code review. Document it when you squash it. That's where future people are going to be looking for it. Now, some people actually just straight up disagree with me on this. And they say, well, you don't need to put the discussion from the pull request in your commit message because it's right there in GitHub on the pull request, so why put it there twice? But that makes some assumptions that I'm not super comfortable with, like that GitHub will be around forever, or that we'll be using GitHub for that project forever. And then this is more of a thing for me that doesn't affect most people, but I work from planes a lot, and I don't have access to GitHub on planes. So I prefer that it's stored somewhere, that multiple people have local copies, that I know it's permanent, and that I can access it on a plane. Hey, random aside, was anybody here at RailsConf? All right, you 4 will get the joke. The rest, don't worry, it's not that funny. So the easiest way to get us to start assuming that you'll be around to help maintain your code is to come back for more than 1 commit. Now, drive by commit can mean 2 things here. For one, it can just mean you submit 1 commit to a project and then never contribute again. It can also mean, and this is the worst one, when you submit a pull request to the project, and they're like, hey, this is great, can you make this 1 change so that we can merge it? And then crickets. And they never come back. And then it just sits there, and it's like, do we close it? Are they ever eventually going to come back? Anyway, so I have this theory about maintenance. This is just based on my personal experience. But I've started to notice that there's a huge increase in the productivity that a person has when contributing to a project after their 3rd pull request. What I found is more often than not, if I'm reviewing somebody's 1st pull request or their 2nd pull request, sometimes it can end up taking more work to review the pull request and work with the submitter to get it into a state where it can be merged. That can often take more time than it would have just for somebody on the team to have gone and fixed it themselves. Now, this isn't a bad thing. I'm not saying like, oh, well, don't submit things because it might have been faster if we just did it ourselves. That's not what I'm saying at all. But there's a number of reasons I think this is the case. It takes some time to become familiar with the code base. Every code base is going to have different conventions, different styles, different structures. You have to learn where all the objects are and what everything can do, and this all takes time. It takes time to become familiar with the reviewer. The process might be different from project to project. Their expectations might be different. How they want things done might be different. And there's always, for the first pull request or two, just going to be like, I did this the way that most things do it, and it's a little bit different, and that's just something you learn over time. It takes time for the reviewer to become familiar with you. When people submit multiple pull requests, over time, this implicit trust starts to get built. And we can start to be a little bit more lax in the code review, because I've seen the person before, and I know that their code is usually in a certain way. I'm not saying that this means like, oh, I just don't review their code, but it can be a little bit less like scrutinizing every line because they've never done this before and they might just be missing something that they're supposed to know. That implicit trust gets built over time. This is entirely based on anecdotal evidence. I don't have like any data of like, this is how long it takes to review things before, after however many. This is just from personal experience. And we still want your contributions. I'm not trying to imply don't contribute even if you're only planning on doing it just once. But if you can come back for more than one, you'll have a much bigger impact that way. Now, the majority of people working in open source are on nights and weekends, and it's volunteer time. I'm not trying to say like, oh, and just be super grateful because they're volunteering time, but it's more just, it's limited. It's a very limited resource. And sometimes it's going to take a while for things to get fixed or to get reviewed. Repeatedly pinging the maintainers or leaving comments like +1, why isn't this merged? Is this still on somebody's radar? They don't usually add much. They just add a lot of noise. Depending on the size of the project, this is what our GitHub notifications look like. And this is just one day. We try to get through all of this every day and attack the backlog, but it's hard sometimes. And I can't speak for every project out there, but for Rails, I can guarantee you, if your pull request has a person assigned to it, it is on our radar. It just might not be at the top of their list. And it takes time. There's a lot of reasons that pull requests can sit around for quite some time, days, months, in some cases even years, although that's hopefully it's not a thing that happens often. Keep in mind that there's often a list of priorities that maintainers have, even if it's not written down anywhere. There's always the problems that are more urgent that need fixing sooner rather than later. And we don't always have time to get it through it all. If something's been open for a while, there's a lot of reasons that could be the case. There was a great response on the TurboLinks repository recently, where there was a fairly old pull request, and somebody commented, like, why is this not fully merged? And one of the maintainers gave a really great explanation of many of the reasons that something can remain open, and in particular, why this one remained open. And it basically boiled down to, we have limited time. Merging something requires code review, which takes time, and we have limited time. This change in particular was a public API change, so it needs documentations and tests, which it didn't have, and that means it's also going to require a more thorough review, which takes more time, and we have limited time. We have other priorities right now, and this particular response included a specific list of here are the main things that we're looking to fix right now, which was, that way people know that we're not just hand-waving. And those take time, and we have limited time. And finally, this wasn't a critical bug, and we have limited time. I wish we could merge everything and fix every problem and have nothing remain open for more than a day, but we can't, that's just not gonna happen. There's not enough time. We're never gonna be able to make everybody happy. We're not trying to be jerks. We're just trying to work in a way that's sustainable. And we're not trying to be a jerk. So please don't be jerks to us. Just remember to be nice. Now, I'm not sure a lot of people necessarily believe the kind of things that we hear sometimes. So I'd like to take a look at my favorite ridiculous example of somebody failing at this rule. So we had a pull request that was adding a method to, yeah. Yeah. And I'm Jewish, so that makes it even more hilarious to me. I don't know. I'm guessing this is what he saw. Maybe this is the only... This person kind of gave me a gift, though, because now when I'm having a bad day, I can just remind myself, at least I didn't get called literally Hitler on the internet today. Although I tweeted that once, and like 3 of my trolley friends immediately replied with, "Literally Hitler!" They're great. If you remember one thing from this talk, make it this. Open source maintainers can sometimes get put on a pedestal. Or we can get characterized as cartoon villains who are just trying to break your app. But we're just people. We're fallible. We have squishy things like feelings. Understanding this is the key to getting involved. It requires empathy. I think the biggest theme that you can take away from this is that the key to submitting a good pull request just simply comes down to considering the point of view of the human sitting on the other side. Thank you very much. Since I have a captive audience, I'd like to quickly plug a project I've been working on. It's a Rust ORM. It's super cool. This is the website. You should come check it out. I'd like to thank Shopify for paying for me to be here. If the upcoming election has you thinking that maybe you want to move to Canada, we should chat. Shopify's hiring. If you have any questions, I will take them one-on-one down here afterwards. And thank you very much. Here's how you can contact me. Have a great rest of the conference.